All right, let's get right into this. The source material we're breaking down today lays out a pretty shocking scenario for the near future. It imagines a world just a couple of years from now, in 2026, where the United States just drops all pretense of diplomacy and takes direct military action. We're talking about a full-on strike against Venezuela.
And this whole thing kicks off with a quote that just cuts right to the chase, attributed in the source material to a future President Trump. "We are going to run the country." You hear that? It's not about hearts and minds or nation building anymore. According to this analysis, it's about one thing: control. And that sets the stage for a massive shift in American foreign policy.
And here it is, the main event of this hypothetical scenario. On January 3, 2026, U.S. Special Forces launch a lightning-fast surgical strike deep inside Caracas. Their target, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. He and his wife are captured, whisked away, and flown to the U.S. to face charges of narco-terrorism. Just like that. So the big question is, how on earth did it come to this?
To really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the surprise strike itself. Then, the year-long build-up that made it all possible. After that, we'll dive into the official story versus what the source claims are the real motives. Then, we'll zoom out to see the message this sends to the rest of the world. And finally, we'll explore what this analysis calls the new rules of power.
Okay, so let's start with the operation itself. Now, this wasn't some messy, drawn-out invasion with thousands of boots on the ground like we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. Nope. According to the source, this was something far more precise.
The strategy has a name, and it's pretty brutal: a decapitation strike. The goal is exactly what it sounds like. You cut the head off the snake. You use overwhelming air power and electronic warfare to completely blind the enemy, and then you send in your most elite special forces, in this case, Delta Force, to grab the target. It's all about being fast, decisive, and avoiding a long, bloodied conflict.
Now, even though that strike on January 3rd seemed to come out of the blue, the source material is really clear that it was anything but. It was actually the final move in a very deliberate chess game that had been playing out for an entire year. The buildup was systematic.
And this timeline really tells the story. You can see the escalation. It all starts quietly, almost bureaucratically, in January 2025 by labeling a Venezuelan gang a terrorist organization. That one little move provides the legal justification for what comes next. By August, you have a massive U.S. naval fleet in the Caribbean. Then comes the USS Gerald R. Ford, one of the most advanced carriers on the planet. By late November, the U.S. just declares a no-fly zone over Venezuela, basically taking control of their skies. Covert drone strikes start softening up defenses in December. See? Each step is a deliberate tightening of the noose, all leading to that final strike.
So you have to ask why. Why go to such extremes? And this is where the analysis really gets interesting, because it presents two totally different stories: the official one for public consumption and the one that geopolitical experts in the source think is the real deal.
So the official story, the one you'd hear on the news, is all about law and order. The justification is that the U.S. is just dismantling a narco-state. It's targeting this cartel of the Suns, a name for corrupt Venezuelan officials, to stop the flow of drugs into American cities. It's framed not as a war, but as a giant police operation.
But to get to the real motive, according to the source, we have to talk about something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this is an old-school U.S. policy. We're talking nearly 200 years old, that basically declared all of the Americas as America's backyard, off limits to other world powers. And the source argues that this doctrine was dusted off and brought back in a big way to justify reasserting total U.S. dominance. And here's the contrast laid bare. On one side, you have this very clean, very justifiable story about fighting crime, but on the other, you have the raw ambition of a Fortress America doctrine. It's a declaration that in its own hemisphere, America's power is absolute, unchallenged by anyone, not China, not Russia, not anybody.
And the source points out it wasn't just about dominance for dominance sake. There were other very practical motives. I mean, we're talking about taking control of Venezuela's oil reserves, which, by the way, are the largest in the world. It was about kicking out rivals like China and Russia who'd set up shop there. There was also the idea that maybe, just maybe, this could help stem the massive migration crisis. And finally, it was about landing a huge blow against socialist ideology in the region, putting immense pressure on Cuba.
So, as you can probably guess, an action this big wasn't just about Venezuela. The analysis is pretty clear that this was a loud, calculated message sent to every other country on the planet.
The source argues that what this really signals is the death of the rules-based international order. You know, that whole idea that nations are supposed to follow international laws and respect institutions like the UN? Well, in this scenario, the US basically says, our interests are more important than your rules. And that changes everything.
And to really hammer this point home, the source brings up this ancient and pretty chilling quote from the Greek historian Thucydides: "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." It's a return to raw power politics. The conversation is no longer about who is right, it's just about who is strongest.
And this message was specifically tailored for certain audiences. For China, which had invested billions in Venezuela, the analysis says its failure to respond with force exposes it as a paper tiger. All roar, no bite. And for a rising power like India, the message is a direct challenge to its policy of strategic autonomy. It's basically saying the time for playing both sides is over. You're either with us or you could find yourself against us. So if this is the new world we're living in, what happens next? What's the future for Venezuela in this scenario? And what's the takeaway for every other nation watching this unfold?
Well, for Venezuela itself, the future is a huge question mark. The best-case scenario, a new US-backed government manages to stabilize the country. But the worst-case scenario is absolutely terrifying. The entire country collapses into a bloody civil war, which would make the current refugee crisis look like a trickle. The irony is, the US could end up making the problem it claimed it was solving infinitely worse.
So, faced with this new reality, what's a country to do? The source actually lays out a pretty clear playbook. Step 1, upgrade your defenses. Massively, because in this world, diplomacy without force is just begging. Step 2, build your economy. A huge economy is the engine that fuels military might. And step 3, use that combined strength to achieve true autonomy. The power to say yes when you want to, and more importantly, the power to say no when you have to.
And that leads us to the final, chilling question the source material leaves us with. If America can actually pull this off in Venezuela, securing a massive oil supply, getting rid of a rival, and facing very few consequences, who's to say it would stop there? With Iran being one of the last major oil powers outside of US control, the question just hangs in the air. Is Iran next?